My parents thought they swallowed my grandfather's $14 million mansion and the legendary Admiral's glory whole. They kicked me out right after the will reading, oblivious that tossing my suitcase triggered a trap he spent years building. But the lawyer turning the page wasn't the real secret. The most dangerous thing in that house wasn't their greed. It was what my grandfather correctly predicted about them. My name is Aurora Brooks. At 34 years of age, I make my living dismantling the polished lies of very wealthy, very careful people. As a senior contract investigator at the Crown Mirror Integrity Office in Chicago, my job is to find the hidden traps, the buried clauses, and the tiny structural flaws in agreements that everyone else chooses to ignore. My agency is a civil oversight firm famous for shining a harsh light on the exact loopholes that corporate giants and corrupt entities purposefully design to go unnoticed. I am paid to see the things people desperately want to keep hidden, to pull the thread that unravels the entire sweater. I spend my days analyzing risk, predicting human greed, and studying the calculated ways people betray one another on paper. Yet, walking up the crushed oyster shell driveway of my childhood home, I realized the most complex web of deceit I would ever untangle was not buried in a corporate merger, but right here on Sullivan's Island in South Carolina. I had flown down from the biting, unforgiving winds of Illinois to the humid, salt-heavy air of the southern coast to bury my grandfather, Admiral Everett Brooks. He was the man who had raised me, the only true parent I had ever known. The estate he left behind was not merely a piece of property. The coastal mansion, valued at over $14 million, loomed against the gray Atlantic sky like a living, breathing entity. It was a fortress of imposing white columns standing at strict attention, flanked by centuries-old live oaks heavily draped in gray Spanish moss. Beyond the manicured, emerald lawns stretched a long private pier, reaching out into the churning ocean like an outstretched hand commanding the tides. Inside, the house was a labyrinth of naval history and rigid discipline. There was the dark wood library smelling of aged paper, leather bindings, and his signature pipe tobacco. There was the meticulous map room where he had plotted naval exercises decades ago, the walls lined with brass compasses and maritime charts. To the side of the main property sat the sprawling East Guest House, a structure large enough to rival most normal homes. Along the wide, echoing hallways, oil portraits of men in crisp military uniforms stared down from the walls, keeping a silent, eternal watch over the estate. The house commanded immense respect, intimidating anyone who crossed its threshold. Much like the man who had built its legacy, Admiral Brooks was never a gentleman in the eyes of the world. To his sailors, his colleagues in the Defense Department, and the polite society of Charleston, he was a force of nature. He was rigid, demanding, and utterly unforgiving of incompetence or cowardice. He did not tolerate fools, and he certainly did not suffer liars. But to me, he was the steadfast anchor in a turbulent, chaotic childhood. While my biological parents were off chasing their own reflections in the polished surfaces of high society, my grandfather was the one who actually taught me how to navigate the world. We spent thousands of hours in his shadowy library and out on the choppy water of the bay. He did not teach me how to bake, or sew, or smile for the cameras. Instead, he taught me how to read the subtle shift in the wind before a massive storm hit the coast. He taught me how to read the micro-expressions on a person's face when they were about to tell a lie, pointing out the slight twitch of a jaw or the defensive crossing of arms. Most importantly, he taught me how to read every single line of a legal document, especially the microscopic print at the bottom of the page, because, as he always sternly reminded me, the devil did not hide in the dark. He hid in the margins. My parents, Grant and Lillian Brooks, were entirely different creatures. Standing across the freshly turned earth of the cemetery that morning, dressed in impeccably tailored black mourning clothes, they looked like the perfect picture of devastating grief, but I knew how to read them. I knew their tells. My father, Grant, was a man who lived his entire life suspended in a state of impending, yet entirely fictional, wealth. He survived on half-baked real estate deals and phantom commercial investments. He always spoke with a frantic, desperate confidence, acting as though a monumental, life-changing success was just 3 or 4 days away. It never arrived, leaving a trail of quiet debts in its wake. Beside him, my mother, Lillian, played the role of the tragic, elegant widow of the family with absolute perfection. She was addicted to the intoxicating glow of charity galas, high society fundraising dinners, and the shallow fame of the coastal elite. She collected powerful friends the way other people collected stamps, using their influence to mask the crushing reality of my father's continuous, humiliating financial failures. The reception back at the mansion after the burial was a masterclass in theatrical sorrow. The Great Hall was filled with state politicians, retired naval officers, and local aristocrats holding crystal glasses of incredibly expensive bourbon. Lillian wept delicately into a lace handkerchief, accepting the sympathies of senators and wealthy socialites, while Grant shook hands with a somber, practiced nod, but I was watching them from the shadows of the staircase. In the brief, unguarded moments between the practiced handshakes and the murmured condolences, I caught them whispering to each other. Their eyes were not cast down in sorrow. Instead, they were darting around the grand room, appraising the antique silver tea sets, the crystal chandeliers, and the dark mahogany furniture. I walked close enough to hear my father mutter to my mother about the future of the house, his voice tight with a suppressed, greedy excitement that made my stomach turn. They were already dividing the spoils, already measuring the drapes, before the ground above my grandfather's casket had even settled. The suffocating atmosphere of this feigned mourning was briefly broken by Ruth Givens, the elderly housekeeper who had served my grandfather with fierce, unwavering loyalty for nearly 4 decades. She approached me in the dimly lit hallway near the kitchen, her hands nervously smoothing down the front of her starched black apron. Her eyes, usually sharp and warm, were wide with a nervous, urgent energy. She opened her mouth, her gaze darting frantically toward the parlor where my parents were enthusiastically entertaining a local property developer. She took a deep breath, seemingly on the verge of handing me a secret that was tearing her apart from the inside. But then she stopped abruptly. The heavy, authoritative footsteps of my father echoed on the hardwood floor nearby, and Ruth quickly closed her mouth. She gave me a tight, sorrowful nod before disappearing into the pantry. Her shoulders slumped. It was obvious. There was a secret breathing within the walls of this mansion, a truth that was not yet ready to be spoken aloud, and Ruth was terrified of what might happen if she broke the silence too soon. That unspoken secret, hanging heavy in the air, dragged my mind back to the night before my grandfather passed away. The memory was sharp, vivid, and incredibly painful. I had sat by his side in the dim golden light of the library, the rhythmic ticking of his antique grandfather clock sounding like a relentless countdown. His breathing had been painfully shallow, his skin pale and thin as aged parchment, but his eyes possessed that same piercing, commanding clarity they always had. He reached out with a trembling hand and gripped my fingers with a surprising, desperate strength that startled me. He pulled me close, the familiar scent of his old cedar cologne mixing with the sterile, sharp smell of medical oxygen. He looked directly into my eyes, ensuring he had my complete attention, and whispered a very strange sentence. He told me that people always skip the page that could save them, just because they are in too much of a hurry to win. At the time, I had gently stroked his cold hand and told him to rest, assuming it was the heavy morphine talking, perhaps a fragmented memory from an old, intense naval negotiation. But now, standing in the grand foyer of his $14 million fortress, watching my parents greedily survey their perceived kingdom, a cold, heavy knot formed deep in my stomach. The evening slowly drew to a close, the last of the mourners departing down the long, winding driveway, leaving the massive house trapped in an uncomfortable, heavy silence. I walked up the grand, curving staircase to my childhood bedroom, feeling a tight, suffocating lump rising in my throat. I did not fully understand the meaning of his final words yet. I did not know what specific page he was talking about, or exactly who was in such a desperate hurry to win. But as I looked out the large glass window at the dark, restless, unforgiving ocean, a profound sense of absolute certainty settled over me. Tomorrow morning, at exactly 9 o'clock, we were scheduled to sit in the cold, leather-bound office of his longtime estate lawyer. And I knew, with every fiber of my being, that tomorrow morning, something was going to change forever. The law office of Malcolm Hale smelled of lemon oil, old paper, and the suffocating weight of finality. Located in a historic brick building in downtown Charleston, the room was a sanctuary of dark oak and forest green leather. Malcolm had served as the fiercely loyal attorney for the Brooks family for nearly 30 years. He sat behind a massive desk, his silver hair neatly parted, his face an unreadable mask of professional detachment. The heavy brass clock on the wall ticked off the seconds, each sound echoing like a gavel striking wood. My parents sat on the plush leather sofa opposite Malcolm. They were practically vibrating with a poorly concealed, greedy anticipation. Lillian had her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her posture rigid, her chin tilted slightly upward in a pose of rehearsed dignity. Grant leaned forward, his eyes locked onto the thick, cream-colored envelope resting on the green blotter. I sat in a high-backed chair near the window, watching the morning sunlight catch the dust motes dancing in the air. The silence in the room was tight and brittle. Malcolm cleared his throat, picked up the silver letter opener, and sliced through the seal. He unfolded the heavy parchment. His voice was a flat, practiced monotone as he began to read the last will and testament of Admiral Everett Brooks. The primary reading was brutally, shockingly straightforward. To his son, Grant, and his daughter-in-law, Lillian, the Admiral bequeathed the entirety of the coastal estate. They were given absolute control over the massive investment accounts, the extensive European art collection, the restored vintage 1968 Jaguar sitting in the garage, and every single tangible asset tied to the family name. I sat perfectly still. The list of millions poured from Malcolm's mouth, transferring an empire of wealth and history directly into the hands of two people who had never understood the man who built it. Grant exhaled a long, shaky breath, a wide, triumphant grin breaking across his face. He actually slapped his knee, beside him. Lillian simply pursed her lips. It was a terrifyingly smug expression, the look of a woman who had just won a bitter, silent war. She truly believed she was always destined to win. She did not look sad. She looked vindicated. Malcolm turned the page. He paused for a fraction of a second, his eyes flickering up to meet mine. In that brief glance, I saw a flicker of something heavy. Pity, perhaps, or warning. Then, he read my portion of the inheritance. It sounded so absurdly cruel that it felt like a physical strike to the face. To his granddaughter, Aurora, the Admiral left his heavy gold Naval Academy ring, a locked cedar box, 3 leather-bound diaries, and his silver pocket watch. That was it. There was no trust fund. There was no property. There was no safety net. The man who had raised me, the man who had taught me everything about honor and strategy, had left me a handful of sentimental trinkets while handing the keys to the kingdom over to the two people who despised us both. Malcolm folded the document and placed it flat on his desk. The reading was over. My parents stood up immediately. They did not look at me. They shook Malcolm's hand with vigorous, aggressive enthusiasm. I stood slowly, picking up the small canvas bag containing my inheritance. The gold ring felt incredibly heavy in my pocket. We walked out of the historic building and stepped onto the humid, bustling Charleston sidewalk. The heat of the morning hit me immediately, but I felt entirely cold. Grant stopped by the curb, turning to face me. He did not offer a comforting hug. He did not offer a word of sympathy. He looked me up and down, his eyes filled with a lifetime of resentment finally bubbling to the surface. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a low, venomous register. Now you understand your place in this family. He turned on his heel and walked toward his car, Lillian trailing behind him like a triumphant queen. I stood alone on the pavement, the noise of the city fading into a dull roar around me. That evening, the true nature of their victory revealed itself with a breathtaking, violent speed. I had returned to the mansion to gather my thoughts, assuming I would have at least a few weeks to pack my childhood bedroom and find an apartment in the city. I was entirely wrong. I walked down the grand curving staircase, the wood groaning softly under my feet, and found my parents standing in the center of the foyer. They were drinking expensive champagne from my grandfather's crystal flutes. A set of architectural blueprints was already unrolled across the marble entryway table. "You need to have your things packed tonight," Grant said, not even bothering to look up from the blueprints. He took a sip of his drink. "The house is ours now. We have no use for a permanent guest." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the sheer audacity of his words. "Tonight? My grandfather was buried yesterday." "Grant." Lillian stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. She waved her hand dismissively, an elegant gesture meant to completely erase my presence. "Do not be dramatic, Aurora. We have a highly sought-after interior designer arriving tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, and a commercial advisor coming right after lunch. They need full access to the property. Your room is going to be gutted. The damp coastal air has ruined the wallpaper anyway." It was not the loss of the money that felt like a knife twisting in my ribs. It was not even the loss of the magnificent house. It was the terrifying, sociopathic speed of their betrayal. Less than 24 hours after the funeral, they were actively, aggressively scrubbing me from the only home I had ever known. They were erasing the Admiral's legacy before the dirt on his grave was even dry. "I am not leaving tonight," I said, my voice dangerously calm. It was the voice I used in interrogation rooms when a corrupt contractor was about to lie to me. Grant's face flushed a deep, ugly red. He slammed his crystal glass down onto the table, the sharp crack echoing through the massive hall. He marched past me, taking the stairs 2 at a time. I heard him storm down the hall and throw open the door to my bedroom. By the time I reached the top of the stairs, he was already marching back out, dragging my heavy leather suitcase by the handle. I had not even finished packing it. Clothes were haphazardly spilling from the sides. He dragged it down the stairs, the wheels bouncing violently against the antique wood. He walked straight through the heavy oak front doors and hurled the suitcase down the front steps. It hit the crushed oyster shell driveway with a sickening crunch, bursting open and scattering my sweaters and documents across the white gravel. I walked slowly down the stairs and stepped out onto the porch. The cool night air whipped off the ocean, biting at my skin. I looked down at my belongings scattered in the dirt. Lillian stood in the doorway behind me. Her face was perfectly smooth, utterly devoid of any maternal instinct or human empathy. She looked at me with the casual, detached expression of someone discussing a change in the weather. "The security code will be changed in exactly 1 hour," she said lightly. "Do not try to trigger the alarm." The heavy oak door slammed shut. The deadbolt clicked into place with a loud, metallic snap. I stood in the darkness, the roar of the Atlantic Ocean crashing against the private pier behind the house. I gathered my clothes, shoved them back into the broken suitcase, and dragged it down the long driveway toward my rental car parked outside the massive wrought iron gates. I loaded the trunk, the mechanical slam echoing in the quiet, wealthy neighborhood. I climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My chest was tight, a suffocating pressure building behind my ribs. I had spent my entire career exposing monsters, but I had completely underestimated the ones sharing my bloodline. I reached into the canvas bag resting on the passenger seat and pulled out the locked cedar box. It was small, heavy, and smelled faintly of tobacco and salt. I took the small brass key Malcolm Hale had handed me at the office, inserted it into the tiny lock, and turned it. The mechanism clicked open smoothly. Inside, there was nothing but a bed of dark green velvet. I frowned, running my fingers over the soft fabric. It felt slightly uneven. I pressed down on the corner, and the velvet lining popped up, revealing a hidden, shallow compartment beneath. Resting in the center of the hidden compartment was a single, small piece of heavy stationery. I recognized the sharp, precise, militant handwriting immediately. It was my grandfather's. My hands shook slightly as I picked it up and held it under the dim yellow glow of the car's dome light. There were only 2 short sentences written on the paper. Read the margins. Watch who rushes the most. I stared at the words, the rhythmic ticking of the car's engine mirroring the sudden, violent pounding of my heart. The memory of his final night flooded back into my mind. People always skip the page that could save them, just because they are in too much of a hurry to win. I looked back through the windshield at the towering, illuminated silhouette of the $14 million mansion. My parents were inside, celebrating their flawless victory, completely unaware of the ground beneath their feet. They had rushed. They had grabbed the prize with both hands, desperate and greedy. I carefully folded the small piece of paper, slipped it into my pocket, and started the engine. The grief that had been threatening to drown me all day suddenly vanished, replaced by a cold, crystalline focus. The game had not ended in Malcolm Hale's office. It had only just begun. The neon sign of the roadside diner buzzed with a harsh, flickering pink light that bled through the heavy morning fog. It was barely 6 o'clock. I sat in a cracked vinyl booth near the back, a lukewarm mug of black coffee sitting untouched before me. My eyes burned from a total lack of sleep, my body stiff from spending the night huddled in the driver's seat of my rental car in a desolate parking lot. But my mind was moving at a terrifying, relentless speed. Spread out across the sticky table were the 3 leather-bound diaries my grandfather had left me. The pages were filled with his cramped, precise handwriting. I was looking for a pattern, a hidden code, anything that would explain the cryptic note I had found in the cedar box. My cell phone vibrated violently against the table, jarring me from my intense focus. The screen illuminated, displaying a single name, Malcolm Hale. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear, the diner's background noise of clinking silverware fading away into the distance. "Good morning, Aurora," Malcolm said. His voice lacked its usual formal cadence. It sounded tight, urgent, and entirely awake. "I have a very specific, very important question for you. Did your parents read the entire will yesterday?" The question hung in the air, sharp and disorienting. "They read what you handed them," I replied, my brow furrowing in confusion. "They heard the distribution of the primary estate, then they practically sprinted out the door." "Exactly," Malcolm said, a hint of dark satisfaction creeping into his tone. "They heard the basic distribution, the shiny objects, the millions, the house, the cars, but they did not ask for the full, bound document. They did not take a copy home to review with their own counsel. They assumed the summary was the entirety of the legal reality." A cold chill washed over me, completely erasing the exhaustion from my bones. In my line of work as an investigator, assuming a summary is the whole truth is the easiest way to lose everything. What did they miss, Malcolm? "Your grandfather was a brilliant tactician," the lawyer replied, his voice dropping low. "What I read to them yesterday was merely the front matter. It was the bait." Attached to the back of that document, separated by a rather thick, boring section of standard legal boilerplate that impatient people always gloss over, is a conditional appendix. It legally binds the transfer of the estate to a series of very strict stipulations. Your parents were in such a massive hurry to claim their prize that they never bothered to turn the page. My breath caught in my throat. The Admiral's final, raspy words echoed in my mind with deafening clarity. "Where are you right now?" Malcolm asked sharply. "On Highway 17, I said, already grabbing my coat and shoving the diaries into my canvas bag. "About an hour outside the city. Turn around. Come straight to my office. Do not speak to anyone." The drive back into Charleston was a blur of gray, punishing rain. The sky had opened up, dumping sheets of water onto the coastal roads, turning the asphalt into a slick, dangerous mirror. The windshield wipers thumped in a frantic, rhythmic heartbeat as I pushed the rental car to its absolute limit. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. Every instinct I had honed dissecting corporate fraud was screaming at me. The pieces were slamming together. The haste with which Grant and Lillian had thrown me out, the changed security codes. The interior designers booked for 8 in the morning. They had acted purely on arrogant impulse, eager to establish dominance, completely blind to the legal minefield they were sprinting across. I arrived at the historic brick building soaking wet, my trench coat dripping water onto the polished hardwood floors of the reception area. I bypassed the stunned secretary and pushed the heavy oak doors to Malcolm's inner office open without knocking. He was already standing by his massive desk, a thick-bound legal folio resting open under the warm glow of a brass reading lamp. "Sit down," Malcolm instructed, gesturing to the green leather chair. He did not offer me a towel or a pleasantry. We were entirely in the realm of business now. I sat, my eyes locked onto the document. "Show me the appendix." Malcolm adjusted his glasses and rotated the folio so it faced me. As I stated on the phone, the transfer of the $14 million estate, including the mansion, the investment portfolios, and the physical assets, was not absolute. It was strictly conditional. Your grandfather knew your parents better than they know themselves. He knew they would try to monetize his legacy immediately. So, he built a wall. He pointed a long, manicured finger at the first indented paragraph. Condition 1, the beneficiaries, Grant and Lillian Brooks, must grant Aurora Brooks the right of permanent, unrestricted residence within the main house for as long as she desires. She cannot be evicted, relocated, or denied access to any common area. A sharp, humorless laugh escaped my lips. They threw my suitcase down the driveway and locked me out before midnight. "I know," Malcolm said, a grim smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Which brings us to condition 2. You, Aurora, are granted absolute co-management rights over the Naval Library, the historical archives, and the preservation of his intellectual property. No structural changes, renovations, or commercial assessments can be made to those areas without your express, notarized, written consent." My mind flashed back to Lillian standing in the foyer, casually mentioning the commercial advisor and the interior designer she had scheduled to gut the rooms. They were already planning to tear down the very walls they were legally obligated to preserve. "And the final condition?" I asked, leaning closer to the heavy parchment. "Condition 3, Malcolm read, his tone growing reverent. "The beneficiaries must fully maintain and fund the Brooks Harbor Fellowship. This was your grandfather's private initiative. It provides transitional housing and maritime vocational scholarships for elderly military veterans and their spouses. It requires a mandatory annual contribution of 15% of the estate's generated income, plus the dedication of the East Guest House for their operational use." I sat back, staring at the lawyer in stunned silence. Grant and Lillian despised charity unless it came with a photo opportunity in a high society magazine. The idea of them allowing elderly veterans to occupy the pristine East Guest House, let alone parting with 15% of their newly acquired wealth to fund blue-collar scholarships, was entirely laughable. My grandfather had engineered a scenario where my parents had to choose between their suffocating greed and the actual terms of their inheritance, and he knew, with absolute military certainty, which path they would take. "There is a clawback clause, isn't there?" I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I could see the architecture of the contract forming perfectly in my head. "A condition is absolutely nothing without a brutal penalty attached to it." Malcolm's eyes gleamed with a fierce, calculating intelligence. "It is the most aggressive enforcement clause I have ever drafted in my entire career. If any single one of these 3 conditions is violated, challenged in court, or neglected, the primary distribution is immediately rendered null and void. Total forfeiture." He tapped the final paragraph heavily with his index finger. "If they fail the conditions, full and absolute ownership of the mansion, the accounts, the art, and every single asset attached to the Brooks name transfers immediately and irrevocably to you." The room spun slightly. $14 million. The legacy. The power. It had never really belonged to them at all. It was a test, a psychological snare disguised as a legal document, and my parents had stepped right into the jaws of the trap within hours of the funeral. They had violated the first condition the moment Grant hurled my luggage onto the crushed oyster shells. They were violating the second condition at this very moment by bringing commercial developers into the library. I looked up at Malcolm, the weight of the situation settling squarely onto my shoulders. They have already broken the terms. What is the next step? Malcolm did not answer immediately. Instead, he opened the center drawer of his desk. He reached inside and pulled out 2 items, placing them carefully on the green leather blotter in front of me. The first was a thick, unadorned white envelope, sealed heavily with red wax. The second was a heavy antique brass key, its teeth intricately carved and worn smooth from years of use. He slid them across the polished wood until they rested right at my fingertips. The silence in the office was thick, heavy with the gravity of what was about to happen. I looked from the key to the lawyer, my pulse thudding in my ears like a war drum. Malcolm leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial whisper. "The mansion is just the first test. Aurora, your grandfather never wrote a will just to divide money." 3 days had passed since my meeting in the law office. The vicious coastal storm had finally broken, replaced by a glaring, suffocating afternoon sun that baked the South Carolina coastline. I sat in the passenger seat of Malcolm Hale's dark town car as we glided up the familiar crushed oyster shell driveway of the estate. The gravel crunched under the heavy tires, announcing our arrival to a house that was entirely oblivious to the legal avalanche about to crash through its roof. The driveway was tightly packed with at least 24 vehicles. There were sleek imported sports cars, massive luxury SUVs, and town cars belonging to the absolute highest echelon of Charleston society. My parents were not spending their afternoon in quiet, reflective mourning. They were hosting an opulent afternoon cocktail reception. Through the massive front windows, I could see the glittering reflection of crystal glasses and hear the faint, lively tempo of a hired string quartet drifting out over the manicured lawns. They had invited the wealthy neighbors, a handful of influential social philanthropists, and most notably, a notorious commercial real estate developer named Owen Mercer. Mercer was a man who made his fortune paving over historical properties to build sterile, high-end vacation resorts. His presence alone confirmed every dark suspicion my grandfather ever held. Malcolm parked the car near the front steps. He retrieved his heavy leather briefcase from the back seat, his expression locked into a mask of absolute, professional severity. We walked up the front steps side by side. I did not bother ringing the doorbell. I simply reached out and firmly grasped the heavy brass handle, pushing the massive oak door open. The grand foyer was flooded with golden afternoon light and the buzzing chatter of the coastal elite. Lillian was standing near the entryway table, holding a flute of expensive champagne, deeply engaged in a conversation with a local socialite. When the heavy door clicked open, she turned, her face instantly hardening. For a fleeting second, a look of profound irritation flashed across her perfectly powdered features. She stepped away from her guest and marched toward me, her heels clicking aggressively against the marble floor. She clearly expected me to be a broken, desperate woman returning to beg for my childhood bedroom, or worse, to make a loud, hysterical scene in front of her important friends. She opened her mouth, undoubtedly preparing to deliver a hushed, venomous threat, but the words died in her throat. She looked at my face. I was not crying. I was not angry. I was completely, terrifyingly calm. I wore a tailored charcoal suit, my posture perfectly straight, my eyes locked onto hers with the cold, calculating precision of a seasoned investigator about to close a fatal trap. The sheer weight of my silence seemed to physically push her back a step. I walked right past her without uttering a single word. I stepped down into the sunken parlor, the center of the lavish gathering. The room was packed with people dressed in light linens and expensive silk. Grant was standing by the fireplace, laughing loudly at something Owen Mercer had just said. Mercer was a tall, sharply dressed man with predatory eyes and a smug, confident grin. I walked directly to the large, antique marble coffee table in the center of the room. The conversation around me began to falter. The string quartet, sensing the sudden drastic shift in the atmosphere, allowed their music to trail off into an awkward, scraping silence. Dozens of eyes turned to watch me. I opened my leather bag, pulled out a thick, heavy stack of documents bound by a navy blue legal ribbon, and dropped it onto the marble table. The heavy thud echoed sharply through the quiet room. Malcolm Hale stepped to my side, surveying the frozen crowd with the authority of a judge entering a courtroom. He cleared his throat, his voice resonating with deep, undeniable power. "Good afternoon," Malcolm announced, addressing the entire room rather than just my parents. "I apologize for the interruption. However, as the executor of the late Admiral Everett Brooks' estate, it is my legal duty to inform all present parties of a highly immediate shift in ownership regarding this property and all associated assets." Grant stopped laughing. His face drained of color, his jaw slacking slightly as he stared at the lawyer. "As of 9 o'clock this morning," Malcolm continued, his tone clinical and unyielding, "the conditional transfer of this estate to Grant and Lillian Brooks has been officially and permanently revoked, due to direct, documented violations of the testamentary appendix occurring within less than 24 hours of the initial reading. Absolute legal ownership of this mansion, the land, the investment portfolios, and the family trusts has been lawfully transferred to Aurora Brooks." The parlor went entirely dead. The silence was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. A wealthy woman standing near the grand piano physically froze, her crystal wineglass hovering midway to her lips. Owen Mercer took a sharp, sudden step backward, his smug grin vanishing completely. A look of genuine panic washed over his face. It was immediately obvious to me that he had already struck a lucrative, backroom handshake deal with my parents, a deal that relied entirely on them owning the dirt beneath his feet. He realized in an instant that his private, under-the-table negotiation was now completely worthless. Grant lunged forward, his face twisting into a mask of ugly, desperate rage. "That is a lie," he shouted, his voice cracking loudly in the silent room. "That is an absolute forgery. We own this house. You read the will yourself." Malcolm did not flinch. He calmly reached into his suit jacket and produced a secondary folder. He snapped it open, extracting a stack of freshly stamped, watermarked county documents. "This is the official certification of transfer filed with the county clerk 3 hours ago," Malcolm stated, holding the paper up so the golden seal caught the light. "It bears the notarized signatures, the authenticated seal of the court, and the exact time of activation for the penalty clause. I also have the appended security log from the alarm company, proving the lock codes were changed to exclude the legal co-manager of the estate, constituting a direct, fatal breach of the primary condition." Lillian pushed her way through the frozen crowd, her hands trembling violently. The champagne flute slipped from her fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor, but no one even looked down. She stared at the thick, bound document resting on the marble table. "What condition?" she stammered, her voice high and breathless. "What are you talking about? There were no conditions." I looked at my mother, feeling a surge of pure, icy satisfaction. This was the exact moment I had waited for. I picked up the notarized document, turned to the heavily highlighted appendix, and held it out to her. "Read it," I commanded, my voice low but carrying effortlessly through the dead, silent room. Lillian hesitated, her eyes darting frantically around the room, taking in the shocked, judgmental stares of the very society she worshipped, the philanthropists, the investors, the neighbors. They were all watching her world collapse in real time. I said, "Read it," I repeated, stepping closer, leaving her absolutely no room to escape. With shaking hands, she took the heavy document. She stared at the highlighted paragraph. Her mouth opened and closed silently for a few agonizing seconds before she finally forced the words out. Her voice was barely a whisper, thick with profound, inescapable humiliation. "The beneficiaries must grant Aurora Brooks the right of permanent, unrestricted residence. Failure to comply with any single condition results in immediate, total forfeiture of the primary estate, transferring all assets entirely to the aforementioned granddaughter. She stopped reading, her breath hitching in her throat. The paper trembled violently in her hands. The public shame was absolute. She had to read aloud, to the very people she was trying to impress, the exact lines she had been far too arrogant and lazy to read just a few days prior. She had exposed her own blinding greed to her entire social circle. Grant looked like he was about to collapse. He stared at Owen Mercer, desperately seeking some kind of support. But the developer was already stepping backward toward the foyer, actively distancing himself from a sinking ship. The guests, realizing they were standing in the middle of a catastrophic family execution, began setting their drinks down on any available surface. A mass silent exodus began as people shuffled toward the front door, desperate to escape the toxic, suffocating atmosphere. My parents stood in the center of the ruined party, completely stripped of their power, their dignity, and their imaginary fortune. They looked at me, expecting me to scream, to demand they pack their bags and throw them out onto the street exactly as they had done to me, but I did not. True revenge does not require shouting, it requires absolute control. I stepped closer to Grant, looking him dead in the eye. I delivered a single sentence that was colder and far more terrifying than a simple eviction notice. "I am not kicking you out tonight," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly steady. "But understand this very clearly. You do not own the ground you are standing on. You do not own the walls around you. From now on, every single decision in this house goes through me." I turned away from them, leaving them to stand in the wreckage of their own profound stupidity. The massive front door continued to open and close as the last of the high society guests fled the property. I walked toward the hallway leading to the kitchen, needing a moment of quiet to let the adrenaline subside. As I stepped into the shadowed corridor, a hand reached out from the pantry and grabbed my arm. It was Ruth Givens. The elderly housekeeper looked absolutely terrified, her chest heaving as if she had just run a marathon. She pulled me into the alcove, away from the prying eyes of the remaining staff. Her fingers dug tightly into my forearm. "Aurora," she whispered, her voice shaking with a deep, frantic urgency. "You need to go to the East Wing right now. It happened last night while they were busy planning this ridiculous party." "What happened, Ruth?" I asked, my investigative instincts instantly flaring back to life. She looked down at the floor, her eyes wide with fear. "The library. The heavy doors were forced open. The whole place has been completely ransacked. And those heavy metal lockboxes, the ones your grandfather kept bolted under the main desk. Several boxes of his original, sealed documents have completely disappeared." It was shortly after 2 o'clock in the morning when the sprawling mansion finally fell into a heavy, uneasy silence. The coastal wind howled against the reinforced glass windows, masking the sound of my movements. I sat on the floor of my childhood bedroom, the small brass key Malcolm Hale had given me resting heavily in the palm of my hand. Earlier, I had found the hidden warning note under the velvet lining of the cedar box, but the heavy brass key clearly belonged to something else, or somewhere else. I picked up the wooden box again, running my fingertips carefully along the intricate, hand-carved grain. My grandfather never wasted a single gesture. I pressed along the bottom edge, feeling for a seam. Near the back right corner, my thumbnail caught a microscopic indentation. I inserted the brass key into the nearly invisible slit and turned it clockwise. A sharp, mechanical click echoed in the quiet room. The entire solid oak base of the box slid outward, revealing a secondary, much deeper cavity completely concealed within the thick wood. Inside the hidden compartment lay a single piece of heavy waterproof drafting paper. I unfolded it under the beam of my phone flashlight. It was a hand-drawn schematic of the estate grounds, tracing the shoreline directly behind the main property. A red ink line bypassed the main house entirely, leading out to the wooden boathouse at the end of the private pier and pointing straight down. It was a blueprint for an old, reinforced storm bunker. I slipped quietly out of my room and moved like a ghost down the grand staircase. Ruth was already waiting for me in the shadows of the kitchen hallway. clutching a heavy iron flashlight in her trembling hands. She did not say a word. We slipped out the back door and moved stealthily through the wet, salty night air. The rhythmic, violent crashing of the Atlantic waves against the wooden pilings easily covered the sound of our footsteps on the gravel. We reached the boathouse. The structure smelled strongly of engine oil, decaying kelp, and damp wood. Beneath a massive pile of heavy canvas tarps and rusted fishing nets in the far corner, we uncovered a heavy steel floor hatch. It took both of us pulling with all our combined strength to break the rusted, saltwater seal. With a loud, grinding groan, the metal door swung upward. A rush of cold, intensely stale air hit our faces as we peered down a narrow flight of concrete steps, descending into pitch-black darkness. Ruth flicked on the flashlight. The yellow beam swept across a subterranean room that looked less like a storm shelter and more like a highly classified military operations center. The damp concrete walls were lined with heavy-duty, moisture-proof steel safes. Industrial metal shelving units held dozens of neatly labeled archive boxes containing document photocopies, stacks of external hard drives, and rows of microcassette tapes. In the center of the cold room sat a gray metal desk holding a battery-powered camping lantern and a tall stack of heavy leather-bound ledgers. The bunker smelled of ozone, old paper, and my grandfather's meticulous, brilliant paranoia. This house did not simply hold family memories, it was a fortress guarding hard, undeniable evidence. I pulled the chain on the lantern, casting a harsh white light across the desk. I opened the first ledger. The pages were completely covered in his unmistakable, disciplined handwriting. As I scanned the first few columns, my professional training as a contract investigator immediately locked onto the pattern. It was a complete, shadow accounting of the Brooks Harbor Fellowship. For years, my grandfather had been quietly tracking a massive financial bleed. A staggering amount of money had been methodically, systematically siphoned out of the Veteran Support Fund. I pulled a corresponding accordion file from the nearest open safe. The paper trail was damning. The diverted cash was being routed to a completely obscure, shadowy entity registered under the name Harbor Light Cultural Society. I flipped to the state incorporation documents inside the folder. The primary director and sole authorized signatory listed was Lillian Brooks. I spread a thick stack of printed receipts and bank statements across the metal desk. It was a masterclass in white-collar theft. There were hundreds of fake invoices for tens of thousands of dollars, categorized vaguely as cultural fundraising, charity music nights, and historical conservation consulting. But the money did not lead to any actual charitable work or civic improvement. It was a highly sophisticated web of financial shell games. I traced the cross payments directly from the fake charity into accounts paying for high-end interior decorators, luxury European travel agencies, private catering firms, and phantom staff salaries. My mother was bleeding the Veteran Charity Fund entirely dry to finance her extravagant, high-society lifestyle, laundering the stolen money right under everyone's noses through fictitious gala expenses. But the rot went much deeper than my mother's pathetic vanity. In a bright red plastic folder tucked at the back of the safe, I found a stack of printed electronic mail correspondences spanning the last 2 years. The communications were between Grant and Owen Mercer. My stomach violently turned as I read the exchanges. My father had not just met the developer recently. He had been secretly, desperately negotiating to sell out the entire estate the very second the Admiral took his last breath. Mercer's master blueprint, attached to the back of the email chain, outlined a complete and total demolition of the historic property. He intended to build an ultra-luxury, members-only coastal club, to make the commercial rezoning application easier to push through the city council. Grant had explicitly agreed in writing to dismantle the Naval Library and scatter the priceless military archives. They planned to deliberately erase the historical significance of the land so the Preservation Board would have no reason to block the commercial development. That was exactly why my parents were in such a frantic, desperate rush to gut the East Wing and the library today. They needed to destroy the history and bury the evidence before a preservation society could step in and protect it. Grant was willing to throw decades of irreplaceable naval history into an industrial dumpster just to secure a zoning variance and a massive payout. At the very bottom of the safe lay a small handheld cassette recorder. I picked it up, my hands suddenly feeling very cold. I pressed the play button. The tape hissed with static for a few long seconds before my grandfather's rough, gravelly voice filled the damp concrete room. He sounded physically exhausted, his breathing labored, yet his mind was fiercely, terrifyingly lucid. He spoke clearly about his dark suspicions. He stated he knew the numbers in his accounts were not adding up correctly. He knew about the whispered, late-night phone calls, and the sudden, unexplained influx of cash my parents flaunted after supposed charity drives. Then, his voice dropped to a disgusted, low growl that made the hair on my arms stand up. He explicitly stated that he knew someone in his own bloodline was circling his bed like a starving vulture, preparing to eat the corpse of his legacy the absolute second he closed his eyes. I clicked off the recorder. The silence in the underground bunker was absolutely deafening. I looked up at Ruth. She was standing near the stairs, tears streaming silently down her weathered, exhausted face. She had known they were stealing, but seeing the sheer, monumental scale of the betrayal laid out on the metal desk was entirely overwhelming. I stared at the ledgers. The first phase of this war, the conditional will that stripped them of the mansion in front of their wealthy friends, was merely a tripwire. It was a superficial test designed only to expose their immediate, opportunistic betrayal. But the second layer of the game, the terrifying truth buried down here in this damp concrete tomb, revealed a systematic, long-term criminal conspiracy. They had been stealing from him and from vulnerable veterans for years. A new, terrifying question began to form in my mind, casting a dark, permanent shadow over everything I thought I knew about my own family. My parents were not simply greedy, pathetic leeches waiting for a wealthy old man to die. The level of deception required to run a phantom charity and negotiate a secret commercial demolition took calculated, sustained malice. Were they merely the eager beneficiaries of this corruption, or were they deeply criminally embedded in a massive fraud that extended far beyond the wrought iron gates of this estate? The evidence sitting in front of me suggested they were not just terrible parents. They were felons, and I possessed every single piece of paper needed to prove it. My parents did not retreat into quiet shame. People who have spent their entire lives constructing a flawless public facade do not simply surrender when the scaffolding cracks. Instead, they went on the offensive. Within 48 hours of the disastrous cocktail reception, I was served with a massive, aggressive lawsuit. Grant and Lillian had retained Claire Donnelly, a notoriously ruthless litigation attorney in Charleston, whose primary tactic was overwhelming her opponents with a blizzard of vicious, deeply personal allegations. The petition filed in probate court did not just contest the appendix, it explicitly accused me of elder abuse and psychological manipulation. Donnelly crafted a venomous narrative claiming I had swooped down from Chicago during my grandfather's final vulnerable months, whispering poison into the ear of a cognitively declining veteran to steal the estate out from under his devoted children. The legal filing was merely the tip of the spear. The real war was being waged in the country clubs, the charity boardrooms, and the hushed corners of elite coastal society. The local aristocrats eagerly embraced the role of the victimized parents. In their insular world, a wealthy heir inheriting everything was the natural order of things, while a granddaughter rewriting the rules was a dangerous aberration. Whispers spread like a toxic coastal bloom. The story morphed rapidly. I was no longer the rightful protector of a legacy. I was a calculating, cold-blooded corporate investigator who had waited in the shadows for the exact right moment to hijack a fortune. I was branded an opportunist, a traitor to my own blood. The poison inevitably drifted north. On a damp Tuesday morning, my private cell phone rang with a secure call from the managing director of the Crown Mere Integrity Office. The agency traded exclusively on the unimpeachable moral standing of its investigators. We were supposed to be the untouchable arbiters of truth, the people who caught the fraudsters. Now, my name was suddenly tied to a highly publicized, scandalous family dispute involving allegations of undue influence and stolen millions. My director was not angry, but his tone was rigidly professional and entirely unsympathetic. I was given exactly 48 hours to submit a comprehensive internal transparency report regarding the ongoing litigation. If my personal legal battles cast even a shadow of a doubt on the firm's reputation, I would be placed on immediate administrative leave. I was fighting a war on two fronts, defending my home in the South while desperately trying to anchor my career in the North. Behind my parents' sudden legal bravery, I saw the distinct, greasy fingerprints of Owen Mercer. Grant and Lillian were completely broke. They could never afford Claire Donnelly's astronomical retainer fees on their own. Mercer was quietly bankrolling their entire legal assault. He was terrified of the preservation clauses I now controlled. If he could keep the estate tied up in vicious probate litigation for a few months, he could exhaust my resources, force a settlement, and clear the path for his luxury resort. He was feeding their delusion, promising them unlimited financial backing as long as they fought me tooth and nail for the dirt beneath the mansion. The psychological warfare escalated into physical intrusion late Thursday night. I was asleep when the secondary perimeter alarm chimed softly on my tablet. I immediately pulled up the closed-circuit camera feeds. A shadowy figure was prying open a ground-floor window in the west wing, far away from the areas my grandfather had heavily fortified. I watched the intruder slip inside, a flashlight beam sweeping frantically over the antique furniture. This was no random smash and grab. The thief bypassed expensive silver and electronics, moving directly toward the old study desks and filing cabinets. When the intruder briefly turned toward a hallway camera, the infrared lens captured his face. It was not a professional burglar. I recognized him from the society pages I had reviewed. He was a private logistics contractor, a man who regularly managed the transportation and setup for Lillian's lavish charity galas. My mother had sent one of her own hired hands to break into the house. By the time the local police arrived, the contractor had vanished into the dense coastal woods, leaving a shattered window and empty drawers in his wake. As I stood in the drafty hallway sweeping up broken glass, Ruth approached me, her face pale and drawn tight with guilt. She confessed that she had noticed things going missing weeks before the funeral. Sensing the creeping danger, she had quietly boxed up a small collection of my grandfather's financial records and hidden them in the attic. However, she tearfully admitted that she had been too late to save the most critical pieces of the archive: an original Naval War Diary and a master donation ledger. The two items that directly cross-referenced the missing charity funds had already been taken from the locked cabinets. The police took a standard report and left, entirely unequipped to handle a conspiracy wrapped in a family dispute. I returned to the bunker and spent the remainder of the night scouring the 3 leather-bound diaries my grandfather had left directly to me. I knew he would never allow his enemies to corner him without an escape route. On a page dated late last year, I found a string of seemingly random alphanumeric codes scribbled in the margin next to a note about high tides. It was not a nautical coordinate. It was a standard formatting sequence for a commercial storage lease. I ran the numbers through a public database search and found a match at a sprawling, anonymous, climate-controlled warehouse district near the Charleston harbor. The sun was just beginning to rise over the cargo ships when I pulled up to the metal gate of the storage facility. I bypassed the main office and walked straight to unit number 412. I punched the date of my grandmother's birthday into the heavy digital padlock, a guess based purely on the sentimentality my grandfather rarely showed but always felt. The lock clicked green. I rolled up the corrugated metal door. The space was small, smelling faintly of dust and cedar. Inside sat 2 heavy plastic utility crates. I opened the crates and found the missing pieces of the puzzle. There were certified copies of the stolen fake consulting contracts, bank routing numbers for the phantom charities, and duplicate copies of the invoices Lillian used to bleed the fellowship dry. But at the very bottom of the second crate, I found something that completely reframed the entire war. It was a thick dossier compiled by a private financial investigator my grandfather had quietly hired. The documents detailed a massive, catastrophic commercial loan Grant had taken out 5 years ago, My father had attempted to develop an independent marina down the coast. The project had completely collapsed due to gross mismanagement, environmental fines, and pure incompetence. Grant was not just chasing a bigger lifestyle, he was drowning in a multi-million-dollar deficit. The private lenders he owed were not the kind of people who accepted polite apologies or restructured payment plans. They were aggressive, predatory creditors preparing to seize everything he possessed and destroy whatever social standing he had left. My father had looked at his aging, brilliant father and saw nothing but a desperately needed life raft. He had conspired to sell the estate to Mercer because the developer's under-the-table payout was the exact amount Grant needed to avoid total financial ruin and potential criminal fraud charges of his own. I sat on the cold concrete floor of the storage unit, the harsh morning light spilling over the undeniable proof of my family's total moral bankruptcy. A small, foolish part of me had wanted to believe their actions were driven by temporary greed or the intoxicating allure of Mercer's promises. But reading the desperate, panicked emails Grant had sent his creditors, the truth settled over me like a heavy lead blanket. Their absolute desperation did not make them pathetic. It did not make them worthy of a single ounce of sympathy. It merely made their choice to betray me, to betray the legacy of the man who built their lives, entirely clear, calculated, and deliberate. They were willing to burn my grandfather's history to the ground simply to keep themselves warm. I packed the documents back into the crates, a cold, unyielding resolve hardening in my chest. The time for defensive maneuvers was finally over. I transformed my grandfather's dark oak library into a corporate war room. I did not waste time crying over my father's massive, crippling debts or my mother's pathetic, fake charities. Panic and heartbreak are for amateurs. I reverted entirely to my professional training. I brought in a massive glass whiteboard, setting it up right beneath the towering oil portraits of stern naval officers, and began charting a precise, irrefutable timeline of the fraud. I pinned up the bank statements, the fake invoices, and the storage facility lease agreements. Using thick red markers, I connected the data points. The timeline was a masterpiece of premeditated betrayal. I aligned the exact dates of the embezzled fund withdrawals with the lavish society galas Lillian had hosted. I matched the first encrypted email sent to the real estate developer with the frantic, late-night clearing of the historical archives by her hired contractor. The immediate changing of the security codes and my violent eviction on the extremely cold night of the funeral were not the actions of grieving, irrational parents. It was a highly calculated, sequential operation designed specifically to legitimize their total control over the estate and its assets before anyone could ask a single question. I did not confront them. I did not scream at them across the breakfast table or demand apologies they were incapable of giving. I simply dismantled their power, piece by piece, with ruthless bureaucratic precision. Through Malcolm Hale, I filed an emergency temporary injunction in the county courthouse that legally froze every single tangible asset on the property. I hired an independent, ruthless auditing firm from out of state to systematically tag and inventory every piece of antique furniture, every silver spoon, every first edition book, and every oil painting in the $14 million mansion. The classic restored sports car sitting in the garage was booted and legally sealed. Then, I brought in a high-end private security firm. Within 48 hours, they had installed a state-of-the-art surveillance system covering every square inch of the exterior grounds, the main hallways, and the perimeter of the estate. My parents were no longer the arrogant masters of a coastal castle. They were effectively inmates, living under 24-hour observation in a museum they were not allowed to touch. Instead of turning the main house into a toxic, claustrophobic personal battlefield, I shifted my focus outward to control the public narrative. I unlocked the heavy doors of the sprawling East Guest House, aired out the damp, unused rooms, and officially reopened the space as the temporary operational headquarters for the Brooks Harbor Fellowship. I reached out to the local veteran networks and personally invited the very people my grandfather had quietly supported for decades. Suddenly, the crushed oyster shell driveway was no longer filled with imported luxury sedans and society elites holding crystal champagne flutes. It was lined with pickup trucks and modest, sensible cars belonging to retired naval mechanics, elderly service members, and their devoted spouses. The optics in the wealthy coastal community shifted drastically and immediately. While my parents were busy leaking vicious, desperate rumors and paying a predatory litigation attorney to file aggressive lawsuits just to save face, I was actively transforming the Admiral's legacy into something genuinely, undeniably useful. The local society pages and community boards began to notice the stark, undeniable contrast. The public tide was turning against them. Malcolm arrived at the estate late Tuesday afternoon, carrying a weathered manila folder under his arm. He had been digging through the deep storage vaults of his own law firm and discovered a brilliant, final masterstroke my grandfather had prepared months before his medical diagnosis. It was a fully completed, notarized application requesting elite historical preservation status for the entire coastal property. If we submitted the heavy stack of paperwork to the city council before the end of the month, the developer's greedy dream of bulldozing the library and building a sterile, luxury coastal club would be permanently destroyed. The land and the structures would become a protected state landmark, rendering the dirt absolutely worthless to a commercial predator like him. However, I still needed the stolen Naval War Diary. It was the crucial, keystone piece of evidence linking the historical, irreplaceable value of the estate to the Fellowship's stolen operational funds. By methodically tracing the digital financial footprint of the private logistics contractor who had broken into the West Wing, I discovered a short-term, high-premium lease agreement for a climate-controlled, maximum security vault located directly inside the developer's private corporate headquarters downtown. Owen Mercer was not just waiting for the land. He was actively holding the stolen, priceless naval diary as physical collateral, ensuring my parents would not dare to back out of the demolition deal or turn on him. That evening, the suffocating tension in the house finally broke my father. Knowing the surveillance cameras were active in the interior hallways, Grant paced the back stone terrace in the dark, entirely oblivious to the highly sensitive directional audio receivers the security team had discreetly installed near the outdoor seating areas. Sitting in the dark library with a pair of heavy headphones clamped over my ears, I listened and recorded as he made a desperate, pathetic phone call to the developer. His voice was high, shrill, and cracking with genuine, unadulterated panic. He practically begged the man for a massive cash advance, admitting out loud, clearly and undeniably, that his aggressive private creditors were threatening severe physical violence if he did not produce a multi-million-dollar payment within 7 days. He was a drowning man, and the recording captured every single gasp for air. The walls were closing in fast, and Lillian could finally feel the oxygen thinning. The following morning, she walked quietly into the library. Her expensive designer clothes looked slightly rumpled, and her perfectly powdered, composed face was visibly cracking at the edges. She tried to play the absolute last card she held in her hand. She sat in the leather chair across from me, actual tears welling in her eyes, and softly, desperately pleaded that we should drop the injunctions and keep this entire financial dispute strictly private. She whispered that a respectable family should never, under any circumstances, air its dirty laundry in a public courtroom. She spoke softly of forgiveness, bloodlines, and moving forward together. But I looked at her trembling hands, her darting eyes, and knew exactly what I was seeing. It was not maternal remorse. It was not a sudden realization of the pain she had caused me. It was the absolute paralyzing fear of public humiliation. She was absolutely terrified of her wealthy, judgmental, high society friends discovering that she was nothing more than a common, desperate thief hiding behind a fake charity. After she quietly left the room, realizing her tears had absolutely no effect on me, I opened the third leather-bound diary my grandfather had left in the cedar box. On a crisp page dated shortly after his grim medical diagnosis, he had written a single, defining sentence in thick, uncompromising black ink. Compassion without boundaries eventually becomes a subsidy for weakness. I sat in the silence of the library, staring at his precise handwriting until the profound truth of the words burned themselves permanently into my memory. That was his final, silent directive to me. I carefully packed the encrypted audio recordings, the detailed financial ledgers, the signed historical preservation application, and the timeline documents into my heavy leather briefcase. The desire for a quiet, peaceful resolution was completely gone. I possessed the absolute truth, and I made a silent vow to my grandfather right then and there. I was going to follow the evidence all the way to the bitter end, completely unbroken, entirely focused, and absolutely unmerciful. The probate court finally slammed the heavy wooden gavel down on our rapidly shrinking timeline. A mandatory evidentiary hearing was officially scheduled for the second week of November. This single day in court would absolutely determine the legal validity of the will and the explosive, heavily disputed appendix. By a terrifying twist of bureaucratic fate, the City Historical Preservation Board also scheduled their final, binding vote on the estate's landmark status for that exact same week. The collision course was permanently set, and the impact was going to be completely devastating. Sensing the approaching deadline, Claire Donnelly, the notoriously aggressive litigator my parents had hired, unleashed her primary weapon. She formally filed a massive, deeply offensive motion claiming my grandfather had suffered from severe, undocumented cognitive decline during his final 6 months of life. Her legal brief was a masterpiece of malicious fiction. She painted a brilliant, sharp military tactician as a confused, easily manipulated old man. Her strategy was dangerously simple. If the presiding judge believed her fabricated narrative, the conditional appendix that gave me control of the mansion would be entirely voided, handing the $14 million estate right back to Grant and Lillian. The sheer pressure was mounting rapidly, and it made the predators desperate. Owen Mercer cornered me in the shadowed parking garage of Malcolm Hale's office building on a dark, rainy Tuesday afternoon. The smug, untouchable arrogance that previously defined his face was entirely gone, completely replaced by a twitchy, sweating, wide-eyed anxiety. He did not offer a polite greeting or a professional handshake. He immediately offered a bribe. Standing between two concrete pillars, he proposed a completely off-the-record arrangement, promising me a massive, 8-figure cash payout and a sprawling luxury penthouse condominium in downtown Charleston. It would be fully paid for, entirely tax-free, in exchange for my absolute silence and my immediate signature releasing the estate for commercial development. I looked at the developer, noting the slight, uncontrollable tremor in his right hand. I flatly refused. I did not even entertain a counteroffer. I walked away, my heels echoing loudly on the concrete, knowing perfectly well that a predator only offers to pay millions for something when he is absolutely terrified he's about to lose it for free. Back at the coastal mansion, the air was so thick with unspoken threats and paranoia, it felt like breathing underwater. The breaking point arrived late Thursday evening when Lillian, prowling the grand hallways like a trapped, panicked animal, managed to steal Ruth's secondary cell phone from the kitchen counter. My mother was desperately digging through text messages and emails for any scrap of leverage. Instead, she found a digital copy of a heavily encrypted audio file I had asked the housekeeper to temporarily store. Lillian lacked the technical skills to unlock the encryption, but the file name alone, explicitly labeled as a master recording of Grant begging the developer for a cash advance, sent a shockwave of absolute paralyzing panic through the house. We were living under the exact same roof, silently passing each other in the dark, echoing corridors, fully aware that a single misplaced word or a dropped glass could detonate the entire fragile ceasefire. That suffocating panic ultimately drove my father to act with staggering, unbelievable stupidity. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, the silent security alerts flashed brightly across my tablet monitor. I sat up in bed and watched the high-definition infrared feed from the west hallway. Grant was tiptoeing toward the side exit, sweating profusely, carrying a heavy canvas duffel bag. The bag was filled to the brim with the priceless, antique silver flatware that had belonged to the family for generations. Tucked awkwardly under his other arm were 2 original heavily framed oil portraits of naval commanders that had hung in the formal dining room for half a century. He was trying to smuggle the assets out to his car, desperate to pawn them in the city for quick cash to hold off his violent, predatory private creditors. I sat alone in the dark, my finger hovering over the digital alarm trigger, but I slowly pulled my hand back. I let him load the trunk of his car. I let the high-definition cameras record every single agonizing, pathetic, desperate second of his midnight theft. Snaring him in the middle of the night for stealing spoons was a minor, insignificant victory. I needed the undeniable, high-resolution evidence for a much larger stage. While my parents were busy acting like common thieves in their own home, I was actively securing an impenetrable, towering wall of expert testimonies. Malcolm and I tracked down Admiral Thomas Vance, my grandfather's closest lifelong friend and a highly decorated, universally respected military veteran. We also located the private, licensed hospice nurse who had spent every single day with my grandfather during his final 3 months. Both individuals eagerly and happily signed sworn, heavily notarized affidavits that completely destroyed Claire Donnelly's fabricated narrative of cognitive decline. They were both fully prepared to stand in front of a probate judge and testify under oath that Admiral Everett Brooks remained sharply lucid, exceptionally decisive, and possessed a terrifyingly clear understanding of every single multi-layered legal trap he had constructed before his death. In a parallel victory, Malcolm delivered the final, devastating blow to Mercer's grand commercial plan. Through relentless legal pressure and the threat of federal investigation, the lawyers secured a signed confession from a mid-level city archive clerk. The terrified clerk admitted, on official city letterhead, that Owen Mercer had funneled a substantial, illegal cash bribe directly to his department to deliberately bury my grandfather's historical preservation application. Mercer had orchestrated the administrative delay to ensure his commercial demolition permits would be quickly approved before the city council ever had the chance to review the historical protection request. The developer's entire aggressive strategy was built on actionable, easily prosecutable fraud. The evening before the brutal probate hearing, I threw a highly calculated, meticulously planned event at the mansion. I did not call it a party, and I certainly did not call it a celebration. I called it a private memorial gathering. I sent heavy formal invitations to everyone who held a critical piece of our fate. I invited the extremely wealthy neighbors, the voting members of the City Preservation Board, the local military veterans from the fellowship, Malcolm Hale, and several prominent, gossiping socialites who had eagerly consumed and spread my mother's vicious, destructive rumors. Grant and Lillian descended the grand curving staircase wearing their absolute finest, custom-tailored mourning attire, pasting tight, heavily strained smiles onto their pale faces. They genuinely believed I had organized the gathering because the immense legal and social pressure had finally broken my resolve. They thought I was setting the elegant stage to publicly announce a quiet, dignified private settlement, a desperate attempt to save the family name from total public destruction. They mingled through the crowded parlor, holding their heads high, whispering sweet, tragic, calculated lies to their wealthy friends. They were entirely, hopelessly oblivious to the terrifying reality of the room they were standing in. I was not there to surrender, and I was certainly not there to negotiate a peaceful exit. I stood quietly near the massive stone fireplace, holding a glass of sparkling water, watching them sip their expensive drinks. A cold, electric anticipation hummed heavily through my veins. They did not realize I had meticulously arranged this entire evening just to pull every single witness, every single liar, and every single victim into one unified, inescapable frame. I was locking them all inside the exact same narrative right before we stepped into a courtroom. The one place on earth where words finally cost everything when they are spoken under the heavy, unforgiving weight of a sworn oath. The memorial gathering was chillingly beautiful. Hundreds of low, flickering pillar candles cast long, dancing shadows across the dark mahogany walls of the parlor. Framed black and white photographs of Admiral Everett Brooks rested on every polished surface, his stern eyes seemingly watching the crowd. The rhythmic, heavy thud of the ocean waves crashing against the private pier outside echoed through the open terrace doors, providing a somber, relentless soundtrack. The room was packed with the highest echelon of Charleston society, but the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. I felt the heavy, judgmental stares pressing into my back from every direction. The guests were sipping their expensive drinks, exchanging hushed, expectant whispers. They were waiting for a spectacle. They were waiting for a deeply fractured family to finally shatter into a million pieces on the antique Persian rugs. I stepped to the center of the grand room, gently tapping a silver spoon against a crystal water glass. The murmurs died instantly. I did not raise my voice, but the flawless acoustics of the high ceiling carried every single syllable perfectly. I formally announced the absolute, irrevocable future of the $14 million estate. I declared that the property would no longer serve as a private monument to vanity or a bargaining chip for commercial developers. It was officially being rebranded and permanently restructured under the name Brooks Harbor House. I detailed the comprehensive expansion of my grandfather's fellowship. We were establishing a dedicated center providing maritime vocational scholarships, pro bono legal consulting, and fully funded transitional housing for elderly military veterans and their spouses. Furthermore, the massive West Wing would be completely transformed into a publicly accessible maritime history archive center, preserving the legacy of the naval commanders who had actually built and defended this country. The polite applause had not even begun to form when my father violently shattered the heavy silence. Grant stepped forward. His face flushed a dark, furious crimson. His voice was a harsh, ugly bark that ripped through the elegant atmosphere. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, loudly accusing me of being a cold-blooded, manipulative thief. He screamed that I was publicly parading my stolen charity project just to humiliate my family, actively robbing my own parents of their rightful home to stroke my massive, twisted ego. A shocked, breathless murmur rolled through the crowd of wealthy neighbors and philanthropists. A few older women actually gasped, clutching their pearl necklaces in horror. I stood perfectly still. The old version of myself, the furious, deeply wounded daughter, would have screamed back. She would have dragged his humiliating multi-million-dollar marina debt into the light right then and there, exposing his pathetic financial failures to all of his wealthy friends. But the seasoned investigator prevailed. I looked at his red, sweating face and offered absolutely nothing but a terrifying, calm silence. I did not engage in a petty shouting match. I simply looked him dead in the eye and stated clearly that tomorrow, the truth would speak for me. While Grant was busy making a pathetic, emotional scene in the parlor, my mother was desperately attempting a tactical strike of her own. Lillian had quietly slipped away from the crowded ground floor, creeping up the grand, sweeping staircase toward the master suite and the private studies. She was hunting for my personal legal files, hoping to find any shred of leverage or vulnerability she could hand to her vicious litigation attorney before the morning hearing. Instead, she hit a solid, impenetrable wall. She reached the upper landing only to discover that every single heavy oak door on the second floor had been retrofitted with commercial-grade, biometric keypad locks. Standing silently beside the reinforced doors was a towering, uniformed private security contractor with an earpiece and a completely unreadable expression. He politely but firmly instructed her to return to the ground floor immediately. In that humiliating, deeply isolating moment on the shadowed landing, Lillian finally understood that the illusion was entirely dead. The absolute power of the estate had completely permanently changed hands. She was merely a hostile guest in a fortress she could no longer breach. Down in the parlor, the real estate developer was having his own silent, catastrophic realization. Owen Mercer, normally the most arrogant predator in any given room, was standing near the towering glass terrace doors. His perfectly tailored suit suddenly looking slightly too tight, he was intensely watching Malcolm Hale. The seasoned estate lawyer was standing in a quiet corner, deeply engaged in a serious, hushed conversation with two very specific guests. One was the terrified city archive clerk Mercer had illegally bribed, and the other was a senior financial investigator from the state tax board. I watched from across the room as the blood completely drained from Mercer's face. His polished, untouchable demeanor violently cracked. He realized his secret. Under the table demolition deal was not just dead, it was actively turning into a highly publicized, multi-agency criminal investigation. He quietly set his untouched drink on a passing waiter's tray and practically sprinted out the front door, fleeing the memorial before the city officials could even turn around to look at him. As the heavy grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 11 times, the last of the confused, whispering guests finally departed down the crushed oyster shell driveway. The massive house settled into a profound, exhausted quiet. I stood in the darkened foyer, loosening the collar of my blazer. Ruth Givens stepped out from the shadows of the dining room. The elderly housekeeper looked physically lighter, as if a massive, crushing weight had finally been lifted from her tired shoulders. She reached out and gently squeezed my hand. In a low, steady voice, she finally confessed the last missing piece of the puzzle she had been hiding. She told me she had not just suspected my mother of tampering with the archives, she had physically witnessed it. Late in the evening, the night before the very first will reading at Malcolm's office, Ruth had watched from the darkened pantry as Lillian personally carried several heavy, sealed cardboard boxes of original financial documents out the back door and loaded them directly into the trunk of her luxury sedan. It was the absolute, undeniable proof of premeditated theft, completely destroying their upcoming legal defense of simple, innocent ignorance. I thanked Ruth and sent her to bed. I walked alone into the dark, silent library, the heavy scent of old paper and cedar washing over me. I sat down at my grandfather's massive wooden desk and pulled out the small, handheld cassette recorder I had found in the bunker. I had listened to the beginning of the tape days ago, but tonight I needed to hear the entire thing. I pressed play, letting his rough, commanding voice fill the empty room. The tape hissed softly. He spoke about his life, his regrets, and his profound, unwavering love for me, but it was his final, heavily emphasized sentence that made my breath catch in my throat. He stated with absolute, terrifying clarity that unmasking them is only the opening act, and that real justice must be completed in a place where no one can speak and take it back. I paused the tape. I sat in the pitch-black room, staring at the faint, silver moonlight reflecting off the brass compasses on the wall. He was absolutely right. The fierce, burning anger in my chest had wanted to publicly destroy my parents at the memorial gathering. I had wanted to scream their crimes to their wealthy friends and watch them crumble in the parlor. But I understood now why I had held back. True, permanent revenge cannot be detonated prematurely at a cocktail party. Gossip fades. Social scandals are eventually forgiven or forgotten by the elite. A true, fatal strike must be executed under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of a courtroom. It must be bound by legal precedent, sealed by a judge, and stamped into the permanent public record. Every single piece of evidence had to stand entirely on its own weight, completely stripped of emotion, leaving them absolutely no room to manipulate, deny, or appeal. The long, agonizing night finally broke. The early morning sky over the Charleston waterfront bled from a deep, bruised purple into a cold, piercing gray. I stood on the back terrace, watching the tide pull away from the wooden pilings of the private pier. I was dressed in a minimalist, sharply tailored black suit, my hair pulled back tightly, my face completely devoid of makeup or hesitation. I picked up my heavy leather briefcase from the kitchen island. Inside rested the ledgers, the stolen documents, the audio recordings, and the final, sealed envelope my grandfather had left for me. I walked out the heavy oak front door, the locking mechanism engaging with a loud, final click behind me. I stepped into the driver's seat of my car, started the engine, and drove down the long driveway toward the city. The false, suffocating calm was officially over. I was heading to the trial that would decide absolutely everything. The probate courtroom in downtown Charleston was packed to absolute capacity, radiating a stifling, heavy heat that even the industrial air conditioning could not defeat. Every single polished oak bench was completely full. Grant and Lillian sat perfectly rigid at the plaintiff's table, flanked by Claire Donnelly. My parents wore their finest, most conservative charcoal suits, projecting an aura of wounded, dignified aristocracy. A few rows behind them sat Owen Mercer, his face slick with a thin layer of nervous sweat. The gallery was deeply divided. On one side sat the local press, the city preservation board members, and the wealthy, gossiping socialites who had eagerly consumed my mother's toxic rumors. On the other side, filling 3 entire rows, sat the elderly military veterans and their spouses from the fellowship, men and women who possessed a quiet, unyielding respect for the man whose legacy we were fighting over. Claire Donnelly launched her offensive with breathtaking theatrical aggression, pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor. She delivered a masterclass in emotional manipulation. She painted a vicious, entirely fictional portrait of me, describing a cold, calculated, estranged granddaughter who had swooped down from Chicago during an old war hero's final vulnerable months. She dramatically pointed a perfectly manicured finger at me, accusing me of systematically isolating a cognitively declining veteran, poisoning his mind against his own devoted children just to swallow a $14 million coastal estate whole. She pleaded with the judge to strike down the conditional appendix, arguing it was the unnatural product of elder abuse and psychological coercion. I sat next to Malcolm Hale at the defense table, my face completely devoid of emotion. I did not flinch. I did not glare at my parents. I let the silence stretch out after Donnelly finally took her seat, allowing the heavy weight of her accusations to hang in the stale courtroom air. Malcolm stood up slowly. He smoothed the front of his tailored suit jacket and walked deliberately toward the judge's bench. He carried the heavy, leather-bound master copy of the will. He did not immediately object to Donnelly's speech. He did not offer a passionate counter-argument. Instead, he placed the heavy binder on the wooden podium, opened it, and bypassed the primary distribution clauses. He bypassed the brutal conditional appendix that had already stripped my parents of their power. He moved his hands deliberately, grasping the heavy parchment, and slowly, loudly, turned to the very last page. It was a page he had never read aloud in his office. It was a page my parents never knew existed. "Your Honor," Malcolm said, his voice ringing with absolute, terrifying authority. The plaintiffs have built their entire case on the assumption that Admiral Everett Brooks was a confused, easily manipulated victim of cognitive decline. However, the testator anticipated this exact, shameful strategy. Included as the final addendum to this document is a notarized, sworn declaration accompanied by highly specific audiovisual instructions, to be executed only in the event that his children attempted to contest his final wishes in a court of law. Malcolm gestured to the court bailiff, who rolled a large monitor to the center of the room. The screen flickered to life. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery as the sharp, commanding face of my grandfather filled the screen. He was sitting in his dark wood library, wearing his formal navy blazer. He looked pale, but his eyes burned with a fierce, uncompromising clarity. His rough, gravelly voice echoed through the silent courtroom. He stated his full name, the exact date, and his precise location. Then, he delivered the fatal blow from beyond the grave. He looked directly into the camera lens and stated that he knew perfectly well that his son and daughter were deeply compromised, greedy individuals who would stop at nothing to liquidate his life's work. He explicitly declared that he possessed full, unimpaired mental capacity. Most importantly, he stated that if Grant and Lillian Brooks ever dared to drag his granddaughter into a courtroom to challenge the conditional appendix, he authorized the immediate, unsealed release of his private investigative files to the state prosecutor. The video ended, leaving the courtroom in a state of absolute, paralyzed shock, Grant's face completely drained of blood, turning a sickly, ashen gray. Lillian gripped the edge of the wooden table so hard her knuckles turned stark white. Malcolm did not give them a single second to recover. He called his witnesses. The private hospice nurse took the stand, swearing under oath that the Admiral was sharper than most men half his age, until the very hour his heart stopped. Admiral Thomas Vance, wearing his chest full of military commendations, fiercely testified to his best friend's brilliant, tactical mind. A state-certified forensic document examiner confirmed that every single signature, initial, and date on the multi-layered will was executed with perfect, deliberate motor control. Then, it was my turn. I stood up and handed a massive, heavily indexed binder to the bailiff to enter into the permanent public record. I did not shout. I simply dismantled their lives piece by piece, dropping the evidence with the clinical precision of a guided missile strike. I submitted the shadow ledgers proving the systematic withdrawal of funds from the Veteran Fellowship. I submitted the incorporation documents for Lillian's fraudulent shell charity. I laid out the certified banking records detailing Grant's massive, catastrophic debts from his failed marina venture. I provided the shady, encrypted demolition contracts between my father and the real estate developer, but the physical documents were just the foundation. I played the high-definition infrared video captured by the mansion's security system. The entire courtroom watched in absolute silence as Grant Brooks, sweating and panicked at 2 o'clock in the morning, frantically stuffed priceless, centuries-old family silver and historical oil portraits into a canvas duffel bag to pawn them behind my back. Finally, Malcolm submitted the sworn, written confession from the city archive clerk, proving that Owen Mercer had paid an illegal cash bribe to stall the historical preservation application. The pressure in the room became completely unsustainable. Owen Mercer, realizing he was staring down the barrel of severe federal bribery and racketeering charges, violently broke. The developer leaped out of his seat in the gallery, his face red and slick with panic. He frantically shouted to the judge that he had been manipulated, completely throwing my parents under the bus to save himself. He loudly confessed to the entire scheme, admitting on the official court record that they had conspired to turn the historic estate into a private, ultra-luxury coastal club, deliberately planning to erase the historical value of the land and illegally push me out onto the street. The judge brought the heavy wooden gavel down like a thunderclap, permanently silencing the chaos. The ruling was swift, brutal, and entirely merciless. The court upheld the absolute validity of the will and every single attached appendix. The judge dismissed my parents' lawsuit with extreme prejudice, explicitly stating it was a frivolous, malicious filing. Furthermore, the judge ordered all evidence of financial fraud, embezzlement, and bribery to be immediately transferred to the district attorney for separate criminal and civil prosecution. Before the gallery even stood up to leave, the representative from the City Preservation Board marched to the front of the room and signed the Emergency Historical Protection Order, permanently shielding the mansion from any commercial development forever. I turned to face my parents. They were entirely destroyed. Their wealth, their social standing, and their false dignity had been incinerated under the harsh fluorescent lights. Because Grant had explicitly violated the temporary injunction by attempting to physically steal the sealed silver and paintings, he had legally forfeited any remaining grace period. I looked at the two strangers who shared my bloodline and delivered the final terms of their defeat. I gave them exactly 14 days to pack their personal clothing and vacate the premises entirely. They were forbidden from touching a single historical artifact, barred from accessing any estate funds, and permanently stripped of their right to ever play the role of the coastal elite hosts again. Several months later, the crushed oyster shell driveway of the estate was filled once again, but this time it was entirely different. The grand opening of Brooks Harbor House was a quiet, profoundly meaningful affair. The sprawling East Wing was alive with the sound of veteran counselors and legal aids working diligently. The dark wood library had been completely restored, the heavy oak doors thrown wide open to the salty coastal breeze. The original Naval War Diaries and the heavy ledgers were safely returned to their rightful places in the glass display cases. The people walking the grand hallways were not there to admire the expensive chandeliers or drink imported champagne. They were there to find a safe place to stand, a place to rebuild their lives. I stood alone in the center of my grandfather's library, running my hand along the edge of his massive wooden desk. The air smelled of aged paper and the eternal, restless ocean. The burning, toxic anger that had fueled my return from Chicago was completely gone, replaced by a deep, anchoring peace. I finally understood the true weight of the legacy he had left behind. The greatest inheritance he gave me was not the $14 million mansion, nor the vintage cars, nor the antique silver. It was the extraordinary opportunity to prove that I could step into the absolute darkest depths of human greed, wage a flawless, devastating war against the people who betrayed me, and emerge completely victorious without ever becoming a monster myself. Thank you for listening to the story. Please comment below to let me know where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts. I invite you to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support it further by pressing the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by more people.